when an empath goes quiet, it is not silence. It is not confusion. It is not taking space. It is the final stage of something that already ended long before you noticed the change. Most people misunderstand silence. They think it means calm. They think it means healing. They think it means someone is thinking things through. But there is a type of silence that is not thinking. It is deciding. And once an empath reaches that point, the decision is already made. You just weren't invited to the meeting where it happened. Because here is what almost nobody understands about empaths. They don't leave loudly. They don't explode first. They don't announce the breaking point. They absorb. They observe. They analyze. They excuse. They understand you more than you understand yourself. When an empath goes quiet, it is not a sudden emotional reaction, and it is never a simple withdrawal from communication. It is the final expression of a long internal process that started far earlier than anyone around them realized, because before silence ever shows on the outside, there is already a complete shift happening on the inside where the empath begins to register patterns instead of moments, consistency instead of promises, repetition instead of excuses, and what used to be experienced emotionally starts getting processed logically, without the emotional distortion that once protected the connection. And this is where most people misread everything, because they are still reacting to the last version of the empath they remember, not the version that has already moved beyond needing explanation or reassurance. An empath does not arrive at silence quickly. They arrive there through accumulation, through observing the same emotional cycle play out in different forms, the same behaviors wrapped in different apologies, the same distance disguised as stress, the same inconsistency justified as timing. And each repetition does not just add frustration, it removes expectation. And expectation is the foundation of emotional engagement. So when expectation begins to erode, something very subtle but extremely powerful starts to form in its place, a kind of internal clarity that does not rely on emotion anymore. It relies on pattern recognition. And once that shift begins, the empath is no longer inside the experience in the same way. They are outside it, observing it as data. At first, they still try to stay emotionally aligned with what they feel. They still give benefit of doubt even when something feels off. They still explain away inconsistencies because they are naturally wired to understand rather than accuse, but understanding without reciprocity becomes self-draining. So what happens next is not dramatic, it is gradual recalibration, where the empath starts lowering their emotional investment without announcing it. They stop over-explaining their feelings. They stop over-clarifying their needs. They start watching how often they are misunderstood, even when they are being clear. And this repeated mismatch between intention and reception slowly teaches them something words never could. There is a moment inside this process that is almost invisible from the outside, but extremely defining for the empath internally. It is when they begin to notice that their emotional effort is no longer producing emotional safety. They start realizing that vulnerability is not being met with consistency, and care is not being matched with awareness. And instead of reacting loudly to that realization, they begin doing something far more significant. They start conserving themselves, not as punishment to the other person, but as preservation of their own internal stability, because an empath cannot survive in a constant state of emotional output without return, and as this conservation begins, their communication starts changing shape, not in content but in energy. Their messages become shorter, not because they have less to say, but because they are no longer extending emotional energy into spaces that do not reflect it back. Their tone becomes flatter, not because they feel nothing, but because they are no longer adding emotional color to conversations that no longer feel emotionally safe. And even their presence starts becoming less intrusive, less initiating, less reaching, not because they are playing a game, but because something inside them is learning that reaching does not guarantee connection. The critical shift happens when the empath starts separating intention from impact, because up until that point they may still give people credit for what they meant rather than what they consistently did. But once impact becomes the primary metric, everything changes, because intention cannot repair impact when impact is repeated, and repetition is what the empath cannot ignore. So now they are no longer asking did they mean it, but instead asking what keeps happening regardless of what they mean. And that question removes emotional confusion from the equation completely. Once this clarity sets in, The empath begins to mentally simulate outcomes instead of emotionally engaging with present moments. They start predicting patterns based on history rather than hoping for variation based on words, and this is where emotional withdrawal begins in its most important form. Not physical withdrawal, not confrontation, but internal disengagement. They are still present but no longer emotionally participating in the same way. They are listening without absorbing, responding without attaching, observing without investing, and while all of this is happening internally, externally nothing looks dramatic at first, because empaths are not impulsive exits. They are calculated dissolves. They do not break things loudly. They let things lose meaning slowly until there is nothing left to sustain emotional presence, and by the time they become noticeably quiet to others, they have already had dozens of internal realizations that reshaped how I see the entire dynamic, each realization stacking quietly on top of the last until emotional response no longer matches the situation. There is also a stage where the empath begins to detach from the emotional identity they had inside the connection, meaning they stop seeing themselves as the one who explains, the one who fixes, the one who holds emotional responsibility for balance, and when that identity drops away, silence becomes natural, because speaking no longer serves the role they used to occupy, and without that role, communication shifts from emotional maintenance to functional necessity only. At this point, even emotional triggers lose effectiveness, because triggers require emotional access, and emotional access has already been restricted internally, not out of coldness, but out of exhaustion that has turned into clarity, and clarity is far more stable than emotion, so when clarity takes over, emotional turbulence no longer dictates behavior, observation does, and observation is patient, it waits, it collects, it confirms. What makes this stage so difficult for others to understand is that the empath still appears emotionally aware. They still understand what is penning. They still recognize the emotional weight of situations, but they are no longer inside those situations in the same way. They are no longer carried by them. And when someone can see everything clearly without being emotionally pulled into it, their silence becomes not confusion but completion of processing that no longer needs verbal expression to validate itself. They don't leave in one moment. That is the illusion people hold on to, because it is easier to believe in a sudden break than to accept a slow disappearance that was happening right in front of them the entire time. But when an empath detaches, it is never an event. It is a sequence of internal withdrawals that happen long before any visible change appears, and each withdrawal is so subtle that by the time someone notices something is wrong, the empath has already crossed multiple internal thresholds that cannot be reversed by emotional reaction or sudden effort. The first stage of detachment does not look like distance. It looks like adaptation. The empath begins adjusting themselves to reduce emotional friction in the relationship. They stop bringing up small discomforts because they have learned those conversations. Ions either lead nowhere or cost more emotional energy than they return. They start choosing silence over explanation not because they don't care, but because they are calculating without even realizing it that their emotional output is not being matched with understanding, and this is where the withdrawal begins quietly. Not from the person, but from the need to constantly bridge emotional gaps that remain unclosed as this continues. Their emotional availability starts becoming selective. Not in a conscious manipulative way, but in a protective way. They begin noticing which conversations feel safe and which ones drain them. And slowly they unconsciously begin investing less in the ones that drain them. Not by confrontation, but by reduction. Fewer words, slower responses, less initiation. Not because something dramatic happened, but because consistency has already been evaluated and found lacking too many times for their nervous system to keep engaging the same way. What most people miss is that empaths do not detach because of intensity. They detach because of repetition. One painful moment rarely breaks them, but a pattern of similar emotional outcomes creates a form of internal certainty that no longer requires discussion. And once certainty replaces hope, behavior starts changing at the root level. They stop expecting emotional correction. They stop anticipating meaningful change. And when expectation disappears, participation naturally declines. This is why their voice starts to change first, before anything else. It becomes less expressive, less detailed, less emotionally invested, not because they are intentionally withdrawing communication, but because emotional energy is no longer being allocated to spaces that feel uncertain or inconsistent, and language itself becomes functional rather than emotional. They say what needs to be said instead of what they feel, and that shift alone is one of the earliest signs that the internal exit has already begun. Then comes the phase where emotional responsiveness begins to flatten. Things that once triggered deep emotional engagement no longer produce the same reaction, not because they have stopped caring, but because caring is no longer being converted into emotional output. It is being redirected into observation, and observation is passive. It does not react, it records, it compares, it updates internal understanding. And as this internal system becomes more dominant, emotional spontaneity begins to fade. At the same time, the empath starts building distance without physically leaving. They become less reactive in conversations. They stop chasing clarity from people who repeatedly create confusion. They stop reopening emotional loops that have already closed internally. And most importantly, they stop trying to fix what keeps returning to the same broken state. Because fixing requires belief in improvement, and repeated experience has already reduced that belief to almost nothing. What makes this stage so invisible to others is that the empath still participates outwardly. They still respond. They still engage when necessary. They still appear present. But internally, they are no longer fully invested in outcomes. They are no longer emotionally leaning forward into connection. They are no longer anticipating resolution or emotional repair. Instead, they are gradually stepping back into a state where their energy is no longer intertwined with the other person's emotional patterns. As this internal separation grows, their tolerance for inconsistency becomes extremely low, not in an angry or reactive way, but in a quiet, disengaging way. Because they are no longer negotiating emotional reality, they are observing it as it is, without filtering it through hope. And when hope is removed from interpretation, patterns become undeniable, and what was once excused becomes simply recorded as data. There is also a stage where the empath stops emotionally rehearsing conversations in their mind. They stop imagining how things could improve through explanation. They stop constructing internal scenarios where understanding finally clicks into place. Because those mental simulations require emotional investment in outcomes, and that investment has already been withdrawn. So instead of imagining resolution, they begin accepting structure, and structure means patterns that repeat regardless of emotional effort. Eventually, even their presence in the dynamic starts to shift in tone. They become less available in moments where emotional chaos used to pull them in. They stop overextending into situations that repeatedly drain them, and they start preserving emotional energy for themselves without guilt, because they have already learned through repetition that overextension does not create stability, it only delays exhaustion, and this is the part people misinterpret as sudden change. Because from the outside it looks like they became distant, but from the inside they simply stopped re-entering emotional cycles that never changed. They stopped stepping into loops that always ended in the same place. They stopped resetting themselves for connections that never reset their patterns. By the time the empath becomes noticeably quiet, they are not entering detachment. They are revealing it. Because detachment was already completed internally through dozens of small decisions to reduce emotional participation. And what is seen externally as withdrawal is actually just the final visible stage of a process that has been running silently for a long time, and once that stage is reached, they no longer need dramatic exits or emotional explanations, because their connection to the situation has already been reduced to observation without investment, presence without attachment, response without expectation. And what looks like them slowly disappearing is actually the final stabilization of a process where emotional dependency has already been fully dissolved internally. Once hope is gone inside an empath, something fundamental shifts that most people completely misunderstand. Because they assume relationships are held together by presence, communication, or even emotional reactions. But for an empath, the real structure of connection is not built on any of those visible things. It is built on expectation, on the quiet internal belief that something meaningful will eventually change, improve, or align. And the moment that expectation collapses, everything else that looks like connection on the outside continues to exist only as an empty shell of participation without emotional investment inside it. This is why the change is so hard to detect at first, Because nothing obvious disappears, the empath may still respond, may still acknowledge, may still smile in moments where it is socially required, but internally the system that used to generate emotional meaning from those interactions has already shut down. And when that system shuts down, presence becomes purely functional, not relational. They are no longer engaging to build something. They are engaging because interaction is still occurring around them, not because they are emotionally inside it. Need more hope is what keeps an empath emotionally open even in difficult dynamics. It is the invisible force that makes them interpret inconsistency as temporary, misunderstanding as fixable, distance as situational. But when hope repeatedly collides with unchanged behavior, something inside them recalibrates to a different standard, and that standard is no longer based on possibility. It is based on repetition, and repetition removes imagination from the equation, leaving only what has consistently been proven over time at this stage. Even emotional presence from the other person no longer activates the same response, because activation requires internal readiness to receive it, and that readiness is built on expectation. So when expectation is gone, emotional signals no longer land in the same place internally. They are registered, but not absorbed, acknowledged, but not integrated. And that difference is what creates the illusion of distance, even when physical proximity remains unchanged. This is where most people begin to misinterpret the empath completely, because they still see engagement and assume connection, but engagement without emotional participation is not connection. It is behavior, it is output without internal resonance, it is interaction without attachment. And the empath has now separated those two layers so clearly that one no longer influences the other in the way it used to. There is a very specific internal experience that happens at this stage that cannot be seen from the outside, and it is the loss of emotional projection, meaning the empath no longer projects future emotional outcomes onto present interactions. They no longer imagine repair where there is repetition. They no longer build internal scenarios where understanding finally arrives after repeated misunderstanding. They no longer create emotional continuity where none has been demonstrated consistently. And this absence of projection is what makes them appear suddenly different. Even though the shift has been building for a long time, when hope is active, every interaction carries weight beyond itself, because it is connected to a future version of the relationship that the empath is still trying to believe in. But when hope is gone, each interaction is isolated, self-contained, no longer linked to a larger emotional narrative, and that removal of narrative is what strips the relationship of its emotional depth internally, even if externally everything still looks the same. This is also the point where emotional effort from the other side begins to lose impact, not because the empath becomes cold, but because emotional effort is no longer interpreted through the lens of possibility. It is interpreted through the lens of pattern recognition. And if the pattern has already been classified internally as inconsistent, then effort becomes just another data point instead of a turning point. The empath does not become less aware, they become more aware. But awareness without emotional investment produces neutrality, and neutrality is often mistaken for detachment, even though internally it is simply clarity without distortion, seeing without hoping, recognizing without needing, observing without reaching. At this stage, conversations start to feel different, even if the words remain unchanged, because the emotional subtext is no longer being filled in by expectation. Pauses feel longer, replies feel lighter. Moments that used to carry emotional tension now feel flat, not because anything external changed dramatically, but because internal engagement is no loss. Anger supplying emotional depth to what is being exchanged. And this is where presence itself starts to lose its former meaning, because presence used to signal participation in something shared, but now presence is just physical or verbal alignment without internal alignment. So the empath can be there without being inside it, can respond without re-entering, can listen without absorbing, and that separation becomes the new default state without announcement or explanation. Even attempts to reconnect emotionally no longer land the same way, because reconnection requires something to reconnect to, and internally that reference point has already dissolved. It is no longer available in the same emotional structure. So what others experience as trying to get through to them feels to the empath like observing something from a distance that no longer has a direct access point into their internal system. There is also a subtle but powerful shift in how time is experienced in the relationship at this stage, Because when hope exists, time is invested. It is spent waiting for change, anticipating resolution, enduring inconsistency for the sake of future alignment. But when hope disappears, time is no longer invested in the same way. It is simply an experienced moment to moment without emotional expectation attached to it, which makes everything feel slower, lighter, and more detached. What people often fail to realize is that this is not emotional shutdown, it is emotional reallocation. The empath is no longer distributing emotional energy into uncertain outcomes, so that energy returns inward, not as emotional intensity, but as stability. And stability does not seek validation, does not chase explanation, does not require continuation of cycles that no longer produce alignment. At this point, even apologies no longer carry the same weight, because apologies belong to a system where repair is still expected, and expectation is no longer active internally. So apologies are acknowledged but not integrated as change indicators. They are processed as information rather than transformation signals, and that difference is what makes everything feel unresponsive, even when communication continues normally. And gradually, without any dramatic shift or confrontation, the empath reaches a state where internal attachment has fully dissolved, not through rejection, not through AR, but through the complete exhaustion of hope as a functional emotional driver, leaving behind a form of presence that no longer participates in emotional construction, only in observation of what already exists without adding internal projection onto it.